What if everything you were taught about one of America's most powerful native nations was built on incomplete information? What if their true origins stretch back further, connect deeper, and reveal a story so complex that modern science is only now beginning to catch up? Before we go any further, if you've ever felt that history deserves to be told honestly and fully, hit that like button right now, subscribe so you never miss a story like this, and share this video with someone who thinks they already know everything about Native American history. Trust me, they don't. Not yet. Everything about Native American history. Trust me, they don't. Not yet. Let's start with something simple. When most people hear the name Creek or Muscogee, they picture a single tribe, a group of people living in the southeastern United States, speaking one language, sharing one culture. That picture is not wrong exactly, but it is dangerously incomplete. Because the Creek Nation, the Muscogee people, were never just one thing. They were always something much bigger, much older, and much more layered than the name suggests. The word Creek didn't even come from the people themselves. It came from European settlers who saw these communities, living near waterways, and simply called them Creek Indians. It was a geographic label slapped onto a political and cultural reality that Europeans didn't fully understand. The Muscogee people had their own name for themselves. They had their own internal structure, their own laws, their own confederacy, and that confederacy was enormous. At its peak, the Muscogee Confederacy brought together dozens of towns. Some historians say over 50 towns at various points, spread across what is now Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and parts of Tennessee and South Carolina. Had their own name for themselves. They had their own internal structure, their own laws, their own confederacy, and that confederacy was enormous. At its peak, the Muscogee Confederacy brought together dozens of towns. Some historians say over 50 towns at various points, spread across what is now Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and parts of Tennessee and South Carolina. These weren't loosely connected villages. They were politically organized communities with distinct identities, distinct languages in some cases, and distinct histories. Some towns were red towns, which handled war. Others were white towns, which handled peace and diplomacy. This distinction alone tells you how sophisticated their political system was. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Where did all these different groups come from? How did so many distinct communities end up inside one confederacy? For a long time, the answer historians gave was vague. They said the Muscogee were descendants of earlier Mississippian cultures. They pointed to the great mound-building civilizations that flourished across the southeast between roughly 800 and 1600 CE. And that answer wasn't wrong, but it wasn't complete either. Because recent DNA research has started pulling back the curtain in ways that are genuinely surprising. Let's talk about what DNA evidence is actually showing us. Genetic studies of Native American populations in the Southeast have revealed layers of ancestry that don't line up neatly with the simple story of isolated, separate tribes. Muscogee Ancestry carries markers that suggest deep connections to multiple ancient population movements. Some of these markers point to very early migrations, groups that arrived in North America thousands of years before anyone imagined the ancestors of the Muscogee were in the Southeast. Others suggest contact and mixing between groups across vast distances that would have required serious, organized travel and trade. There's genetic evidence suggesting that ancestors of the Muscogee shared lineage with populations from as far away as the Gulf Coast. Distances that would have required serious, organized travel and trade. There's genetic evidence suggesting that ancestors of the Muscogee shared lineage with populations from as far away as the Gulf Coast, and possibly even groups from the Caribbean. This doesn't mean the Creek people came from somewhere else in some dramatic displacement story. It means their ancestors were moving, trading, marrying, and merging with other populations across a huge geographic area for thousands of years. The Southeast wasn't a collection of isolated tribes sitting still. It was a living, breathing network of human movement and exchange. And this matters because it reframes everything. The Muscogee Confederacy wasn't just a political accident. It wasn't just a bunch of neighboring villages deciding to cooperate. It was the natural result of thousands of years of human connection. Different ancestral lines, different linguistic groups, different cultural traditions, all of them folding into one another over millennia, creating something that was genuinely new and genuinely powerful by the time Europeans arrived on the scene. Let's go back even further. Long before the Muscogee Confederacy existed as a recognizable political entity, the Southeast was home to the Mississippian culture. This was one of the most sophisticated pre-Columbian civilizations in North America. Mississippian people built enormous flat-topped earthen mounds. They organized complex chiefdoms. They had long-distance trade networks reaching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Their art, their religion, and their social structures were intricate and deeply developed. Sites like Cahokia in Illinois and Moundville in Alabama were major population centers, places of ceremony, trade, and political power. When the Mississippian chiefdoms began to collapse, Around the 14th and 15th centuries, possibly due to drought, warfare, disease, and internal instability, the people didn't disappear. They reorganized, they moved, they merged with other groups. And the communities that eventually became part of the Muscogee Confederacy were, in significant part, the inheritors of that Mississippian legacy. DNA evidence supports this. The genetic signatures found in modern Muscogee populations show connections to ancient populations from exactly the areas where Mississippian culture was most concentrated. But here's the part that most history books skip over almost entirely. The Muscogee Confederacy also absorbed groups that were not Mississippian in origin. As European colonization spread through the southeast in the 1500s and 1600s, it created enormous disruption. Entire tribes were shattered by disease. Some populations lost 80 or 90% of their people within a generation. Survivors had to go somewhere. Many of them went to the Creek towns. The Muscogee Confederacy became, in a very real sense, a refuge, a place where the remnants of destroyed or displaced peoples could find safety, belonging, and survival. This is why you see such linguistic diversity within the Confederacy. The core Muscogee language belongs to the Muscogean language family. But Creek towns also included speakers of Hitchiti, Alabama, Coasati, and even Natchez, a language isolate with no close relatives anywhere in North America. These weren't foreign languages being spoken by outsiders looking in. They were the living voices of communities that had been folded into the Confederacy and given a home. So when DNA research looks at the genetic diversity within Muscogee ancestry, it isn't finding a single ancestral population that stayed put for thousands of years. It's finding the biological record of that long history of absorption, migration, and merging. The genetics reflect the story, and the story is one of remarkable resilience and openness. Now take a moment, because this kind of deep history deserves one. If this video is opening up something for you, something that feels bigger than the usual surface-level history you were handed in school, then do something real with that feeling. Drop a comment below and tell me one thing about Native American history, because this kind of deep history deserves one. If this video is opening up something for you, something that feels bigger than the usual surface-level history you were handed in school, then do something real with that feeling. Drop a comment below and tell me one thing about Native American history you wish more people knew. And while you're at it, share this video on your social media today, not tomorrow. Today. Because this kind of story needs to reach more people than the algorithm is going to hand it to on its own. You sharing it is what makes the difference. Let's talk about something that often gets lost in the science. The human dimension of what all this genetic and historical data actually means. When we say the Muscogee absorbed refugee peoples from shattered tribes, we're not talking about a bureaucratic process. We're talking about human beings, terrified and grieving, walking into Creek towns and being taken in. We're talking about elders making decisions to open their communities. We're talking about children growing up speaking 2 languages, learning 2 sets of ceremonies, carrying 2 lines of ancestry. The Muscogee social structure actually had a built-in mechanism for this kind of incorporation. The clan system was central to Muscogee society. Clans were matrilineal, meaning you inherited your clan from your mother, and clans were the primary unit of social identity, legal responsibility, and belonging. If you were adopted into a clan, you became a full member of that community. Your origins didn't erase you. Your new belonging was real and recognized. This wasn't charity. It was social architecture designed for a world where populations moved, merged, and transformed. And this points to something genuinely profound about Muscogee civilization. Their political and social system wasn't built on the assumption of a fixed, unchanging people. It was built on the assumption of movement and change. The Confederacy could grow because it was designed to grow. It could absorb difference because difference wasn't treated as a threat. It was treated as something to be organized and integrated. That's an extraordinary thing. It's the kind of social wisdom that modern political scientists still struggle to replicate. Now let's bring in one of the most controversial and least understood parts of this story, the Muscogee relationship with enslaved African Americans and freed people. This is a topic that makes people uncomfortable because it cuts in multiple directions. On one hand, some Creek slaveholders held African Americans in bondage, and that is a historical fact that deserves honest acknowledgement. On the other hand, some enslaved and free African Americans than anything available in white American society. Some became full members of Creek towns. Some married into Creek clans. Some rose to positions of genuine influence. The freedmen of the 5 civilized tribes, including Creek freedmen, are a living example of this complexity. After the Civil War, the Muscogee Nation signed a treaty that granted freedom and citizenship to formerly enslaved people within their territory. This was not a grudging legal technicality. In many Creek communities, it reflected a genuine tradition of incorporating people from outside into the social fabric of Creek life. DNA research on Creek freedmen populations shows exactly what you'd expect from this history. Genetic profiles that blend Native American, African, and European ancestry in proportions that vary dramatically from family to family, reflecting individual stories of connection and survival across generations. This is not a simple story. It never was. And the DNA is the proof, because DNA doesn't simplify, it records. Every migration, every marriage, every act of survival and connection, it all leaves a trace. And when scientists look at the genetic record of Muscogee ancestry, what they see is not one people with one origin. They see a living archive of the entire southeastern North American story. Let's talk about the specific genetic markers that researchers have found and what they actually suggest. Haplogroups, which are basically family branches of human genetics, found in Muscogee, and related populations include markers associated with the earliest. They see a living archive of the entire southeastern North American story. Let's talk about the specific genetic markers that researchers have found and what they actually suggest. Haplogroups, which are basically family branches of human genetics, found in Muscogee and related populations, include markers associated with the earliest human migrations into the Americas. Specifically, certain mitochondrial haplogroups, which track maternal lineage, found in Muscogean-speaking peoples, show connections to ancient founding populations that entered North America from Asia somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. This is consistent with the broader story of Native American origins. But the specific distribution of these haplogroups within Creek populations tells a more nuanced story. Some haplogroups appear in Muscogee ancestry that are also found in populations further south, in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. This doesn't necessarily mean ancient people were sailing back and forth across the Gulf of Mexico, though that possibility has not been entirely ruled out by researchers. What it more likely reflects is the movement of populations over thousands of years along coastal routes and river systems, with genetic material spreading slowly northward and eastward into the southeast over many generations. The southeast was not a closed genetic pool. It was always connected to a broader American world. There are also Y chromosome haplogroups, which track paternal lineage, found in some Muscogee-descended populations that suggest contact with populations from the Great Plains and even the Great Lakes region. This is consistent with the historical and archaeological evidence for long-distance trade networks that connected the southeast to the rest of the continent. Objects from as far away as the Rocky Mountains have been found in Mississippian archaeological sites, copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf Coast. The genetics reflect the same pattern of wide-ranging connection that the archaeology does. One of the most significant and often overlooked findings is what the DNA reveals about the period immediately following European contact. There's a genetic pattern called a bottleneck, a dramatic reduction in the diversity of a population's genetic pool that happens when a large percentage of that population dies suddenly. The bottleneck signature in many southeastern Native American populations is severe. It is the genetic fingerprint of the catastrophic epidemics of the 16th and 17th centuries. In some ancestral populations connected to the Muscogee, researchers have found evidence of population collapses so severe that the genetic diversity of entire communities was nearly wiped out in just a few generations. What came after those bottlenecks is what makes the Muscogee story so remarkable. The genetic diversity in modern Muscogee ancestry begins to recover, not just through natural population growth, but through the incorporation of outside genetic lineages. The refuge communities that joined the Confederacy after European contact of entire communities was nearly wiped out in just a few generations. What came after those bottlenecks is what makes the Muscogee story so remarkable. The genetic diversity in modern Muscogee ancestry begins to recover, not just through natural population growth, but through the incorporation of outside genetic lineages. The refugee communities that joined the Confederacy after European contact brought new genetic lines with them. Those lines survive in the DNA of Muscogee descendants today. The Confederacy didn't just survive colonization politically, it survived it genetically. By staying open, by continuing to absorb and integrate, the Muscogee people preserved a richer biological heritage than they would have if they had remained closed. That is a profound and important point. It's a point that connects directly to the lived values of the Muscogee people, values of community, of kinship, of responsibility to the collective. Those values weren't abstract ideals. They were survival strategies encoded into the social system over thousands of years, and the DNA proves they worked. Here's something else worth sitting with before we get to the final part of this story. If you've made it this far in the video, you're clearly someone who cares about getting history right. So here's a challenge. Think about one person in your life, a family member, a friend, a colleague, who still thinks of Native American history as simple, as a done deal, as something that happened and ended. Send them this video. right now while you're thinking about them. Because the conversation that starts from a video like this is exactly the kind of conversation that changes how people see the world. And changing how people see the world starts with one share, one conversation, yours. The final chapter of this story brings us to the present. And it's a chapter that's still being written. The Muscogee Nation today is a federally recognized sovereign nation headquartered in Muscogee, Oklahoma. They got there through one of the most traumatic forced relocations in American history, the Trail of Tears. In the 1830s, the U.S. government forcibly removed the 5 civilized tribes, including the Muscogee, from their ancestral homelands in the southeast and marched them to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. Thousands died on the journey. The removal didn't just cost them land, it cost them lives, cultural sites, sacred places, and ancestral graves. It was a rupture of almost incomprehensible violence. And yet, the Muscogee Nation survived. They rebuilt their government in Oklahoma. They maintained their language. Muscogee is still spoken today, and there are active language revitalization programs working to ensure it reaches the next generation. They maintained their ceremonies, their stomp dances, their green corn ceremonies, their clan systems. These things continued, not unchanged, because nothing survives centuries without changing, but continuous. There is a living thread from the ancient past to the present, and DNA research is helping modern Muscogee people trace exactly where that thread runs. For many Native Americans, genetic ancestry testing is complicated. Tribal citizenship. There is a living thread from the ancient past to the present, and DNA research is helping modern Muscogee people trace exactly where that thread runs. For many Native Americans, genetic ancestry testing is complicated. Tribal citizenship is determined by documented lineage, not by DNA. A genetic test cannot make someone Muscogee. Citizenship in the Muscogee Nation is based on connection to the Dawes Rolls, the federal census records of Creek citizens taken around 1906. DNA is not a replacement for that kind of documented community membership and cultural belonging. But DNA research at the population level, the kind conducted by anthropologists and geneticists studying groups rather than individuals, has given the Muscogee people and their historians something genuinely valuable: scientific confirmation of the breadth and depth of their ancestral story. When a Muscogee elder says their people have been in the southeast since time beyond memory, the DNA agrees. When a Creek historian says the Confederacy was built from many peoples coming together, the DNA confirms it. When a community member speaks about the generations of connection and survival that made them who they are today, the genetics provide the record of exactly how that survival happened, through openness, through movement, through the willingness to be changed by others while remaining fundamentally themselves. That is the true ancestry of the Muscogee people. Not one bloodline, not one origin point, not one simple story that Europeans could label and put in a box. Their ancestry is a testament to the full complexity of human history in North America. Thousands of years of migration, connection, disruption, resilience, and renewal, all of it encoded in the DNA of people who are alive right now, living in Oklahoma and across the country, carrying that entire epic story in every cell of their bodies. The Creek were never what we thought. They were always something more, something older, something wider and deeper and more human than the simplified version history handed us. And now, thanks to the science that reads the language written inside us all, we can finally begin to tell their story the way it deserves to be told. Not as a footnote to American history, not as a defeated people whose best days are behind them, but as a civilization, sophisticated, adaptive, enduring, whose roots go back to the very first humans to walk the North American continent, and whose story is far from over, because the Muscogee Nation is still here, still governing, still speaking their language, still dancing their ceremonies under the Oklahoma sky, still writing new chapters in the longest ongoing story on this continent. And if that doesn't move you, if that doesn't make you feel the full weight and wonder of what human beings are capable of, then I'm not sure what will. The question we started with was whether everything we knew was incomplete. The answer, it turns out, is yes. But incompleteness is not failure. It's an invitation to look deeper, to listen harder, and to make room for a story that is bigger than the one we inherited. The Muscogee people have been doing exactly that for thousands of years. Maybe it's time the rest of us caught up.